I want to introduce myself. My name is Camilo Santa. I am a specialist on natural capital and biodiversity of IDB. And I would like to also give the floor to the colleagues from UNEP-I and ISD. With them, we have organized this workshop or roundtable panel. So, Thomas, you have the floor. Thank you, Camilo.
Why this roundtable? Well, the title is pretty straightforward, but maybe the general message is that we've been working within FIX and IDFC very seriously on climate risk, maybe less so on biodiversity or nature-related risks. So it's both a research endeavor, but also something that I think needs to mobilize the various institutions in the network. So we have to recognize that maybe we are less far away than we are on climate, but doesn't mean that no one is interested. Quite the contrary, and hence that roundtable to discuss and maybe take these issues more seriously. But I'll come back to that later on. Again, many thanks for the organizers, and I'm happy that you were able to join today's conversation.
Muchas gracias a los panelistas, pero
Thank you very much to the panel members and to the audience. We have competition close by. UNEP-I, if you do not know much about where we are, it's an alliance between the United Nations, the governments looking for global solutions such as climate change, biodiversity, and financial sector. We have 30 years working with the banks in frameworks that may guide the actions, responsible banking principles. The last ones were in 2019, but similar principles for the insurance sector and investment. These topics are part of our daily agenda, not only climate topic, but all the agreements around biodiversity, and of course, the agreement that was signed December in biodiversity, bioplastics, and every time we get new topics that are added to the agenda and that demonstrate, and we will talk about that in the panel, how everyone is interrelated or linked, and the need for the financial institutions to move forward with that vision, a holistic vision of what is the impact of financial flows and the projects that are funded are in the communities and in the economies where they are present. Thank you. This conversation will be in Spanish, English, for the audience in the room and people that are following in the live stream. We are going to start with some address by our keynote speaker, that is Professor Juan Carlos from the Mexican Institute. Juan Carlos, would you like to introduce yourself? And we can start with your presentation. Well, very well. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. Thank you very much. In effect, I am a professor now at the Technology Institute in Mexico, but I had experience both in government and international. I was at the World Bank as an economist, and I was in an international water program, and I was directing the Mario Molina Research Center, and I'm very pleased to be here. I was told that it was a keynote speech, so I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, but I cannot avoid my bias as a professor. And I know that to listen to a person for 10 minutes, it may be somewhat heavy. So I'm going to tell you about the components so we will have clear messages. I'm going to talk about the ecosystem crisis, the biodiversity, the role of development banks to avoid that crisis, and then the important part about lessons of climate finance that could be learned and implemented in the finance vis-a-vis nature. And at the end, I will talk about a message of motivation for development banks. These are the 4 parts, and thank you once again to the organizers and for you for being here. Dear colleagues, the nature is the foundation where our societies and our economies are built. Nature is present in every facet of our lives, from the work of bees pollinating the crops that feed us to the minerals incorporated in the cables and appliances that are connecting us in the digital age, through the air we breathe and the water we drink. Yes, despite its undeniable importance, we often ignore nature, and we are depleting and degrading ecosystems essential to the well-being and development of humanity. The World Economic Forum has brought to life the profound interdependence between the global economy and nature. The forum estimates that more than half of the world's GDP is directly linked to nature. According to the Global Risk Report, loss of biodiversity and ecosystem is one of the main global risks, both in terms of impact as well as probability. The annual cost of the loss of ecosystem services is between 4.3 and 20.2 trillion dollars, according to OECD. This data will contrast with the undervaluation and frequently negligence of nature by some of the agents of the economy and policy. Our incapacity to acknowledge a social value and intrinsic, my colleagues will say, the social value of nature and incorporated in economic and political decisions has taken us through a dangerous degradation path. Mankind is leaving to extinction more species than any other time in history. Statistics tell us that 25% of species in some animals and plants are in danger, with 1 million of species now under in danger. So what is more alarming is the speed of change in our world. This rapid transformation is caused by 5 direct causes: changes in soil use, overexploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, and invasion of exotic species. These causes are the result of underlying causes that cover public policies, values, and social behaviors, patterns of production and consumption, trade, innovations, technological innovations that go from local scale to global scale. It is clear that this degradation endangers the compliance with the SDGs expressed by the Sustainable Development Goals. This goal may only be achieved if we acknowledge the dangerous degradation and depletion path of biodiversity in ecosystems, and we will act accordingly. More than 500 development banks operating in the world at a incredible source or strength for the global financial panorama. The mission is clear: to facilitate sustainable development. Development banks have a power of giving the shape to the global development because they invest approximately $2 trillion per year, and they have an added balance of $12 trillion. Considering the financial capacity, the development banks have the responsibility not only to promote SDGs, but also to lead the wider transformations within the financial system. To approach these challenges in an effective way, the development bank should catalyze transformation changes in the financial, social, economic, political, and technological system. Development banks should acknowledge the value of nature, necessary actions to make sure that the finance projects will take into account costs and benefits, as well as risk opportunities related to impacts on nature. Likewise, development banks should acknowledge that the climate change and biodiversity loss are linked, and for many practical purposes are two sides of the same coin. Scientific evidence is not wrong. The increase of temperature, changes in the rain patterns, and the intensity of climate events encouraged by climate change have deep consequences for natural world. These impacts will go around the ecosystem, affecting species, habitats. The nature is not a passive spectator. It has an influence on climate patterns and the resilience of ecosystem with respect to challenges. A healthy ecosystem may absorb and store carbon, performing a crucial role in mitigation of climate change, while the degradation of nature decreases the capacity to adapt to climate change and will reduce the capacity to provide benefits for mankind. Nevertheless, in spite of these interdependence, the climate change and nature have been discussed separately. This separation has made more difficult our capacity to approach in a comprehensive way the challenges that are related to climate change and nature loss. The financial sector has also dealt with these problems as different concerns. Initial efforts to approach risk related to climate and transition towards a neutral economy in carbon had encouragement, especially after the publication of the recommendations of the TCFD in 2017. The efforts have been focused mainly in the financing of climate change mitigation. To continue closing this gap and to guarantee a comprehensive approach, we have to acknowledge that the effective action requires a joint action both for climate as well as for nature. We have made some progress setting these foundations for climate actions. The foundation for conservation of nature are considerably less developed. This is what our colleague was saying. Talking about the path followed by the financial sector with respect to the climate change, the setting and the strengthening of the following blocks. I'm going to talk about 6 modules that have had a lot of success or a relative success in the world of climate finance that are being developed in the world of nature finance, and the strengthening will help to be more effective, efficient, the role of finance for the preservation of nature. First, a global objective. The Paris Agreement goal of maintaining global warming below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees has contributed to national governments, international organizations, private sector, and other stakeholders will collaborate for the same goal. National objectives according to the global objectives. Paris Agreement has been supported by the SDNs that at the beginning are linking the national policies intervention with the global objectives. Third, global scenarios. These analysis is used by central banks, regulators, financial institutions, and companies to assess the risk and impact of climate change. Scenarios include the ones included, provided by IPCC, NGFS, and IAEA. The international financing flows, the international financial institutions and other institutions promote the transitions throughout their programs and mechanisms for financial support, funding projects that the private agents will not fund, reducing the risk of projects that will contribute to a transition to a decarbonized economy. 5, metrics and objectives for the private sector. So the private sector may act according to the 1.5 degrees of goal. They have had to set objectives and to develop metrics that could be implemented. With the help of the science-based targets, thousands of companies have developed objectives to reduce emissions following the Paris agreements. Public policies and legal framework. Public policies and legal framework will generate certainty and trust among the economic agents, especially among investors. They can set the base also for interventions that will support climate financing and environmental financing, such as a regulation about the dissemination of data related to climate change, ISB, the regulation of energy efficiency or the promotion of renewable energy. They have an impact about mitigation, setting prices for carbon dioxide emission, whether with a tax or a traded things, and the redesign of fiscal policy, for example, for subsidy to fuels in the case of nature subsidy to agricultural activity. At the company level, TNFD and the International Sustainability Standard Board based on TNFD will set the basis so the companies around the world will disseminate their actions with respect to nature. TNFD is based in the same architecture that TCFD, with the dissemination organized around 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management and goals. Before concluding, I would like to give you a message of hope and motivation. The task of integrating risk and opportunities related to nature in governance, strategic frameworks, and operating procedures of development banks is certainly a great challenge, but it's a challenge inherent to the mission of development banks. The development banks have a rich history of project analysis, not only from the perspective of cost and benefit, but from a social perspective. With the years, they have improved the tools and methodologies to assess the social impact of their initiatives. This legacy to consider the well-being of communities and the environment sets a solid base for the integration of considerations related to nature, and it's a testimony of adaptability. Besides, development banks will not undertake this path alone. They are part of an international effort, a multidisciplinary effort to build the foundations of an effective and efficient financial system related to nature. These collective efforts will cross borders and disciplines, encouraged by a shared commitment to preserve the natural wealth of our planet. In this shared mission, they will find force, knowledge, and inspiration. They are not alone. They are part of a global movement working to approach the challenges linked of climate change and loss of nature. The tools, frameworks, and methodologies that are being developed will show the collaboration, that the recognition that the prosperity will depend on harmonious relation between mankind and nature. To conclude, I would like to remind you that the role of development banks to approach a risk related to nature is also a moral imperative. As the catalyzers of change, development banks have the potential of remodeling the financial system and to lead the fight to include the impact of nature in financial decisions. Challenges that we are facing are significant, but also our objectives, our capacities, and our collective determination. Together, as development banks, as a global citizen, we can follow the path towards a future in which economic prosperity and responsible management of the environment will go hand in hand. We have to face this challenge. Our collective responsibility is to make sure that we are really promoting a coexistence between humanity and nature. Let's do it for our well-being and for the following generations. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. This is setting the stage for the conversation that I have skipped somewhat the protocol in order to get to see the changes and the examples so we can have some time for questions. For the IDB case, what we have been doing in public banks in each country is reflected in the first of the cases. And I would like in that way to introduce Mariana so she can tell us about the case of Minas Gerais and the work that has been done. Because according to Jock Brodson, this is not an environmental issue only. It's a economy, security, human dignity, and the foundations for development. How can we understand these in our reporting system, risk analysis, and how we can move also the economy towards where we want to go? I think that Mariana, I can give you the floor if you want to show us this. Thank you.
From the other institutions. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank IDB for the invitation. I work in the Development Bank of Minas Gerais in Brazil. I work in the risk department, mainly with social, environmental, and climate risks. And I will present here some information about our experience with climate risks. So BDMG is a financial institution founded in 1962. The bank is controlled by the state of Minas Gerais, and the main objectives is the promotion of the sustainable development of the state. About climate risks, we have developed some technical cooperations, and the first one was with IDB. and it was assessed the physical risks of the bank portfolio. The second one, it was with French agency, and it was assessed the transition risks of the portfolio. And in the third one, with funding from the UK Pact, we developed a tool for assessing climate risks, both physical and transition, for new operations. Here, I will focus on IDB and French agency cooperations. With IDB, we developed a pilot project, and the main scope was the evaluation of all the macro-regions in Minas Gerais and other states where BDMG has some operations. We assessed all economic sectors supported by the bank, and we had a detailed analysis of some important sectors in the bank's portfolio, such as coffee trading, sugar and alcohol, small hydroelectric power plants, and sanitation. We also had different trainings for different areas, different teams in the bank, and this was very important. The scenarios used were the current climate conditions and low and high emissions in 2030 and 2050. Here we have an extract of the results, and we can see with yellow and orange colors the sectors and the regions with higher risks. So in Minas Gerais, the north and the northwest are the two macro-regions with the greatest exposure. These results considers the scenario of present day. And in the next slide, we can see the same extract, although for 2030. So we can verify that the situation becomes worse in the future. And we had other conclusions, such as the most significant hazards in the state is flash floods and droughts. And agriculture, livestock, forestry, fisheries, and electricity are the sectors exposed to the highest levels of these risks, physical risks. With French agency, we assessed the transition risks. So for each sector, we assessed each component of the transition risk. So the market, reputational, regulatory, and technological risks. And we also have a general risk for each sector. These cooperations were essential for BDMG. We learned a lot. And some of the contributions are, now we have a better knowledge of the climate risks by faced by different sectors and regions in Minas Gerais. We have information how these risks may evolve in the medium and long term. The detailed analysis contributed to the inclusion of climate aspects in the evaluation of the new operations and to support the definitions of new strategies. We had a significant input to the development of new models for risk classification. And it was very important sharing knowledge, raise awareness among different teams at the bank. We have many challenges. Some of them are the adaptation mitigation investments often require long-term commitment, while decision makers face pressures for quick results and immediate actions. To understand weather patterns and extreme events is complex. We need to learn about the extent and speed of the changes. And it's also complex to understand the interaction of this kind of risk, climate risks, with other risks. For example, how to measure the impact of climate risk on credit risk is still a challenge for us. Okay, thank you.
Excelente.
Excellent to see a risk report, transition risks. It will say much more. It will explain much better than anything that I could say about why is it important and what is the purpose of what we're doing. What the Professor Juan Carlos was telling us about the importance of crisis, climate crisis, the urgency of action. And likewise, in the case of NAFIN, we would like to listen to the work being done in Mexico. Christian. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Well, the climate risks are very important in a country such as Mexico, and also for Nacional Financiera as a development bank. Yesterday, I had the opportunity of participating in another table, and I was talking about the the benefits of our geographic location. This geography that we have is exposing us to different risks that are quite relevant, such as hurricanes, droughts, and many other elements such as earthquakes. And this topic is very, very important. And this is one of the main reasons why Nacional Financiera is enthusiastic to be involved in all these aspects. We participate and we are active members in different working groups in Mexico related to this topic, trying to support providing ideas and initiatives, and also listening to the other stakeholders in the market so as to identify the needs that we could maybe not see. I will have to refer to what Juan Carlos was saying during his conversation, that the development banks have a role within the financial market. In the case of NAFIN, we also create market. So we have adopted leadership with respect to climate. And as such, we made the first issuance of a green bond in dollars in Latin America in 2015 for $15 million. In 2016, we also issued the first green bond in pesos for 100 million pesos. Well, I have to say as well, this is the financial market aspect, but we have our credit function as well. We have SARAS for measuring environmental risks, and that is mandatory. It's mandatory to assess the social and environmental impact of the projects that we approve. And it's mandatory, but if we do not comply with it, we will not approve a credit. I have to say as well that currently we are in the process of implementing a general framework, an institutional framework of sustainability in the institution, connecting the different parts that I just mentioned. We made efforts in different sectors and with the participation of business lines, but we are looking to provide a shape to this strategy, of course, with the support of top management and our board of directors. We have a sustainability committee now that it's going to be focusing on the definition of the strategies, follow up, and especially measuring the impact of these strategies. Finally, I would like to conclude with challenges. I agree with what Mariana said a minute ago. The financial cost measurement of these risks is complicated. It's no extreme events, both whether financial risk or climate risks in this case. They are very difficult to estimate. But I would like also to underscore the fact that we see difficulties from SMEs. Nothing we are oriented towards a the micro and small enterprises, SMEs. So it's difficult to follow the CSG criteria. We have a survival experience, and we need to have the help of the development banks so they can follow this framework and to produce a sustainable energy. Thank you very much, Christian. These two cases are quite important to tell us about the change of model, decarbonization of the economy, understanding actions that we are adopting to face climate crisis. And From a IDB, we do have several publications about the work that has been done in the region, the way we have been helping some of the bank. One of them, it's the heat maps. All these publications, you may find it in the IDB webpage, and they will show visually how the sectors will be transformed. And I would like also
and give the word to Barbara to listen to the European Investment Bank. Your work, your experience on climate risk. Please, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Camille, and good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, half of the audience is at my back. I'm very happy to be here today. I have this opportunity to present a piece of work that we have prepared with colleagues at the Economics Department of the EIB on purpose for this year Finance in Common Summit. I'm going to maybe skip the outline in the interest of time and jump directly into the two main parts of this work. By the way, feel free to grab a copy of the paper. And the first, this is not the good presentation. Okay, I'm going to. So the first part of the analysis, which is kind of brutally summarized in this one slide, is a mapping of climate risks in the region, Latin America and Caribbean. And it's based on country climate risk scores that we have developed previously at the EIB. And throughout the analysis, we keep physical and transition risks separate. In this chart, you only see the physical risks. I also had transition risk in another version of the presentation. Here you have climate physical risk prominently featuring particularly for the Caribbean, and where you see acute risk playing a lion's share related to stemming from extreme events. On the other hand, for the rest of Latin America, Central and South, the chronic component is relatively more important, is the impact, the gradual impact of climate change, which is on infrastructure, on agriculture, on labor productivity, etc. I also had another slide with the transition risk, but it's not the good version, I'm sorry, of the presentation. And transition risks are, in comparison with physical ones, are less prominent in Latin America and the Caribbean. They are more in line with other parts, averages in other parts of the world. And the most pressing challenges are represented by the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deploy renewable energy at a sufficient scale. The second part of the work, okay. I'm sorry, but I don't have the right presentation here. The second part of the work that I was going to talk about, we try to extend this mapping to the financial sector, financial intermediaries, and we wanted to understand to what extent banks are well placed or exposed to risks, given the role that they play on the one hand in preserving financial stability, and on the other in providing finance to the private sector and to SMEs in particular. And the way we have approached, the methodological approach that we have developed is very much work in progress, I must say, and that's why the discussion today is going to be valuable in terms of feedback and calibration of the work. We looked at we took the approach in 4 stages. The first approach, we collected data on the exposure of banking sector to the various sector of the economies, corporate and sovereign and household. We then attributed to each of these sector a level of riskiness, both for physical and transition risks. And we then compute a bank score that is the aggregation, where each, it's a weighted average, where the weights are given to the share of the sector in the banking sector portfolio. And what we see is that, well, we also have an overview of the performance of the banking sector through the crisis, and despite the multiple shocks that financial sectors have undergone, the banks remain in the region profitable and sound, although there are many differences across countries. And in the paper you have a lot of country-specific details. And we also see, as you can see on the left-hand side chart, that the exposure of banking system to physical risk is prominent in the Caribbean, whereas the exposure to transition risk is distributed more homogeneously across the region. What we also see in the Caribbean is, again, with considerable differences across countries, is that asset quality is somewhat weaker, and therefore exposure to higher risk sector and high exposure to physical risks leaves the banking sector in the region in a more vulnerable position. The last slide is on using data from the Climate Policy Initiative. Despite the needs and despite the large exposure to physical and transition risk, climate finance accruing to the region is about 6% of the total. This, I think it was for 2019 and 2020. Again, reinforcing a message that we have heard a lot over the past couple of days, that there is a huge gap, and that's where public development and IFIs have a role to play in catalyzing resources, in providing long-term, patient, and affordable financing, catalyzing and crowding in the private sector and working together on innovative solutions, and also on raising awareness and provide capacity building. I'm really sorry because I think this version of the presentation was not the final one, but you have all the details of the analysis in the report. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Barbara. Entender los riesgos.
To understand financial risk is to understand the capital flow. Where should we invest, where not to invest, and then Unit 5 has been presented an important paper where after the Paris Agreement and Montreal Agreement, it is understood that climate and nature are related. There are some reports in both directions. Mabel would like you to share experiences, the learnings. Thank you, Camilo. We have people that came in late. As I said at the beginning, the program of the UN and the environment has been working for about 30 years with the banks and with other stakeholders of this ecosystem. I'm going to share something which is part of the work that we do on a daily basis. The signatory members of the principles of responsible banking, the framework that we have around 380 different countries, the largest one, those that have a more significant impact on the economy of the country, but as well due to the size of the banks, they have large challenges for implementation. take care of different segments. They have different portfolios, different sectors. And the learnings come from this, but I want to share as well some lessons learned, some findings of a project, pilot project, how we developed with Felipe. Maybe it's well informed on this because it was from July 22, February 23, where we were testing some of the UNDP framework that is going to be published. We work with 49 financial institutions from different continents. The objective of the pilot was that one to look at the feasibility of financial institutions from different jurisdictions and from different sizes. We have institutions from Costa Rica, from Brazil, to see how we see it was and the obstacles they face and actions to be shared at a larger scale. We have UNEP 5 is a partner for implementation and for piloting the TNT. And the idea with this partnership is that the financial sector could become an engine promoting implementation of this important framework. These pilot projects allow us to see something that we knew, but we had it clear now. The risks related to nature are new for most financial institutions, but the banks that already had work on topics of mapping climate risk and assessment of climate risk, and some banks have been doing this for over 10 years, so they were better prepared to understand and to start making an assessment of those risks related to nature. More concrete, the level of how ready these institutions were in these aspects, and these clear the CFD allow many institutions to progress in the topic of climate. Once again, and this is something which adds to the discussion of other financial institutions in countries where we have regulations such as Professor Juan mentioned in environmental framework, environmental policies. They have a level of maturity that is higher when they try to understand what it means to include this topic of nature in risk assessment, risk evaluation. Something that institutions identified, those that were part of this pilot, that there was some similarity with natural risk, opportunities for organizations, for businesses, for the strategy, financial planning of financial institutions, such as the GDP, macroeconomic factors, policies for technological development, the climate risk and nature risk scenario use models that could be similar. Physical risk, macroeconomic risk models, and we have other models used in climate risk scenarios that could be adapted to the work with nature. So we are not starting from scratch. In the case of climate and nature, we still see a common challenge, information. And this has been mentioned the last 3 days from different perspectives. In risk of nature, we need some data that could be shared, recent data, to understand if it was a high-quality assessment or evaluation. Professor Juan mentioned in the introduction of the importance of partnership collaboration. This is going to be very clear. If we want to advance effectively and fast, we need to strengthen this collaboration with entities that have worked with biodiversity, that understand this and can help us find solutions for challenges such as data. Other banks are trying to do this. They are identifying clients. They are looking for the information directly with them. They have consultancy work in the field, but not all the institutions have resources or possibility to carry out this type of exercises. So to progress large scale, these partnership with other stakeholders from other sectors are very important. Something else that we identified, there were some examples of financial institutions that were doing climate risk mapping. In the case of marine wind parks, when we do this mapping of climate risk, when we add the component of nature, this may change if we don't see the impact to local biodiversity, the communities that live there, then the risk is not going to be the same. So to leave aside that aspect makes this risk mapping, climate change mapping could be weak or wrong for some scenarios. Findings that I don't think are new findings and need for training to have teams with different profiles understanding indicators are not just emission aspects, but something that has to do with soil, water, and other aspects. If the information is not available or cannot be read because we don't have the scientific skills or the teams well prepared, then this is an obstacle in terms of infrastructure. We do need a robust system of technological infrastructure to have access to some of these topics related to nature, to understand images of geolocation, to have access to maps. And not all the banks are prepared in this direction. So these are investments that have to be seen long-term. As Mariana said, not always this long-term vision is the one that is most important. Rather, we look for important outcomes. So this needs a reflection inside financial institutions. So how to solve with partnerships these type of challenges, strengthening and having resources available to be able to advance. To sum up, because I have taken more time that has been assigned, those that are just starting with this topic of nature, what is ideal is what has been done on climate. We have to add up a new layer with nature. But this has been mentioned these 3 days, not to leave behind the social aspects. We have to go back and not to forget to see the impact that this has at every level, with a comprehensive approach so that we don't have to go back, but rather advance very effectively and efficiently to reach the Sustainable Development Objectives and the Paris Agreements. Thank you, Mabel. Gemma?
Invite you also to set a baseline in what is nature, what is ecosystem services. We've started to talk about it, but probably it's good to remind ourselves what is exactly what we're talking about and how it relates a little bit between climate and nature, just to be sure.
Great, thanks Camilo. And yep, I've got a few slides. So hi everyone, I'm going to give you a very quick Biodiversity 101 to set us up for this. What we'll do is we'll cover the key definitions and terminology, how biodiversity risks link to climate and why it's relevant to business and financial institutions. This is going to be very fast and very high level, so do come and talk to me afterwards if it's not clear. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. It's the living component of natural capital, and it can refer to the level of genetic variation, the variety of species present, or the variety of groups of species or ecosystems. And what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a dynamic complex of plant, animal, and microorganism communities and the non-living environment that interacts as a functional unit. And it can be useful to understand environmental systems in terms of economic stocks and flows. So our environment can be seen as an economic stock, natural asset, or natural capital made up of various ecosystems. And this natural capital underpins our economy and society, and the stock of assets provides us with that flow of goods and services, also known as ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services cover a huge range of goods and services that we derive from the environment, and they're generally categorized as provisioning, regulatory, supporting, and cultural. And these services have immense value to all parts of society, including business. So almost every part of our economy and our well-being actually ultimately depend on ecosystem services. But because these services are provided for free, they are often economically invisible, and that invisibility is actually the root cause of many of our environmental challenges today, because it means that environmental impacts and dependencies don't get factored into economic decision making. So we don't value the ecosystem services enough. If I go back to biodiversity, so as we established, biodiversity describes that level of variation of the living component of natural capital. It is biodiversity interacting with each other and with the non-living components of the environment that generate those ecosystem services we benefit from. So as biodiversity is a key factor for determining the generation of those goods and services, in general, higher biodiversity means a greater range of ecosystem services, better resilience of the system, and then better adaptation to stress. So what is the difference then between nature and biodiversity? So the definition of nature is the natural world with an emphasis on the diversity of living organisms and their interactions among themselves and with their environment. People and societies interact with nature, and we're not separate from it. And nature can be understood through the construct of these four realms, and I've taken this from the TNFD, so you've got land, ocean, freshwater, and atmosphere. Biodiversity is then present in each of those realms. So biodiversity is considered as an essential component of nature. And lots of people use the term biodiversity and nature interchangeably, but basically nature is broader than biodiversity. It encompasses biodiversity, the non-living components, the ecosystems, ecosystem services, and things like water and soil. And so, as we've heard before, nature loss and climate change cannot be separated. So climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss. Nature loss releases emissions, it amplifies climate change, which then in turn drives further loss of species and ecosystem services. And as these natural sinks are put under stress, the capacity to absorb carbon weakens. Nature also has a role in climate change adaptation strategies through the provision of ecosystem services and the resilience to climate impacts. So enhancing the adaptive capacity of ecosystems reduces the severity of those climate change impacts. Now, moving on to how biodiversity is relevant to business. All business activities have an impact or dependency on nature. Impacts create a change in the state of nature, and they can be direct, indirect, or cumulative. And dependencies are aspects of ecosystem services a business is reliant on. So, for example, pollination for crop production. And different sectors have different impacts and dependencies on nature. There's broad consensus around the high impact sectors, just as some of the priority sectors up here, so things like agriculture, mining, energy, and construction, and also the high dependency sectors, so agriculture, forestry, food, and beverage. Now, taking a similar stance to climate change, biodiversity loss can lead to three types of financial risk. So you've got physical, transition, and systemic risk. We don't have time to get into depth in these now, but I'm sure the discussion will cover some of these elements a little bit more. And for banks, biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation can actually have implications on the long-term revenue and returns of business in their portfolios. And so we have talked about risks, but we should also acknowledge there are opportunities. So by nature-related opportunities, we mean activities that create positive outcomes for corporates and financial institutions, and also for nature, and that's by avoiding or reducing impact on nature or contributing to its restoration. So these may be opportunities that significantly reduce nature-related dependencies and nature impacts, or things like business models, products and services that actually contribute to nature-positive outcomes. And they could include actions to protect and sustainably manage and restore natural ecosystems, providing biodiversity and societal benefits such as jobs. And just the graphic on the side is just an example from the World Economic Forum where they think the opportunities might lie. So that's everything. I'm going to stop there. That was a very quick run through. But
that's great. That's great. Thank you, Gemma. and that really sets the scene, Thomas, because we've understood that, I mean, we have decisively moving from clean energy to much more regenerative agriculture. We've understood that nature and climate risks are related, that taking care of nature is taking care also of our economies. Stopping financial crisis is also stopping, in great sense, stopping a climate crisis as we're understanding it. AFD is already moving forward with biodiversity and nature, understanding also where we're going towards into a nature positive scenario. Please.
Okay, thank you so much, Camilo. Maybe just to start a little story, but earlier on, Juan Carlos and just now Jima talked about how esperanza y motivación can be a driver for change, or also opportunities can be drivers of change. I'm going to concentrate rather on fear and risk aversions as drivers of change. Not that it's the whole story, but just for the sake of the presentation. The other story is how AFD progressed in terms of research and taking a nature-related risk into its operation. BDMG and also EIB have run a similar exercise. Just to tell you a story, 3 years back, we had very interesting research together with the French Central Bank to identify within the French banks, commercial banks, the assets held by the banks and the potential risk exposure of these banks relative to a degradation of of nature, let's say nature in France, and potential reduction in ecosystem services. What we did at the time was measuring risk exposure, meaning if an asset can be potentially exposed to a risk. But when you have a serious risk director, let's say Christian asked me, okay, we are exposed to risk, but that's not enough to define a risk. You also need to work on the probability of this risk and also the magnitude of this risk. So in research, many institutions actually measure their potential exposure, but it's way more difficult when you discuss about ecosystem services to assess the probability and the magnitude of this risk. Why is that so? When you run generally, general analysis at the level of a society, you can say, okay, my bank has invested in agriculture, in mining, in forestry. Those are typically sectors that are exposed to a degradation of ecosystem services. But what we tried to do in a recent study together with the South African Reserve Board and also the Biodiversity Institute of South Africa is not only to identify potential exposure, but also to go down to the municipality level and at the asset and loan level of banks to measure whether they actually hold the assets in a region where there is an ecosystem service problem and assets that actually rely on this very specific ecosystem in a particular region. So when we did that exercise in South Africa, I have very nice maps. I can't show them now, but I can show them with the public if they want to show to come afterwards. Is actually to disentangle risk not at the national level, but at the subnational and even relatively fine municipality level, so that we're able to assess not only again exposure, but also the likelihood of an event plus the magnitude of the shock. And we can find figure typically exposure of French assets, and it's similar in South Africa. Between 40 and 50% of economic activities are exposed to shock. Like in South Africa, for example, surface water or groundwater is essential to mining activities, but not all mines will be exposed to a potential reduction in the availability of water. So you have to exactly identify which assets are exposed. And the theory of change behind that is that either banks may voluntarily try to cover or minimize this risk, so that's a more positive approach. And the other one is that the supervisory board of a typical country could ask for banks to reduce their risk more in a more sort of aggressive policy. But I think it's part of change that we need to reduce not only exposure, but also probably reduce the risk themselves by bringing in incentives at the level of banks or other financial institutions, but also regulators, which I think can be very powerful actors of change. And to be honest, it was not natural for AFD as a development bank. Normally, we like to finance a public policy or a particular project. But in that case, risk reduction can come through active projects to reduce risk, but also by accompanying supervisory boards, typically to reduce risk at a systemic level. So I won't go further into the details, but I wanted to insist on that particular agenda because it's moving quite swiftly, and we've seen many other countries actually interested in running a similar analysis, and I'm open to questions, of course, if there are. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Volvemos al español.
We go back to Spanish with Felipe to listen to the work that has been done. And FDD that understands this framework, understand exposure of the asset exposure, how to report this double materiality. How do we take advantage of what we have learned in topics related to climate to tackle the risk of the loss of nature? How do we heal, in quotes, in the financial system to avoid systemic risk? The work that has been done by TNFD globally and recommendations to be published very soon. Thank you, Camilo. Thank you for this invitation. And I want to thank those that have mentioned, made contributions, concepts presented by Gemma, by Professor Juan. I want to talk about invisibility. The task force of TNFD is fully convinced that for financial flows to have positive results with nature, we need to make them visible. These are risks, in words of Professor Godupta, not only could be invisible, but as well silent, and could happen gradually and are seen suddenly. Our economy depends on nature. And recommendations that we are going to publish or launch, New York on the 18th September, have been the outcome of a work of 2 years of open innovation. The NFD is supported by G7, by G20, but we had a task force that represents financial institutions and corporations. We say that we are market-led, and we have carried out an exercise to work with scientific partners with standards before the TNFD, GRI, CDP, and others. And a process of open innovation, more than 250 institutions, financial and corporate, started a pilot project for this frame and gave us some feedback. Aligned with the last session of the plenary that we had, a project was regarding talking to indigenous people and local communities represented at the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity. So we are going to launch 3 things. In the month of September, will be the final part of this process, is the first part of TNFD. First, we have some concept to organize the topic of nature definitions, structures, such as the one presented by Gemma, very clearly. Then, second, recommendations on the dissemination information to be sent to the central banks, to supervisors, financial supervisors, to different national institutions, so that these, they decide on a voluntary basis, or it is established as a demand that corporations and financial institutions both should reveal information within a similar structure, similar to the TSFD. But I want to mention some differences that are important that Juan Carlos mentioned. One, regarding governance, when the organization states how they integrate nature into decision-making process, there is information that is revealed, a commitment with respect of human rights, of indigenous rights, contributions of nature for people, and to be involved to work with the stakeholders from the highest levels of governance. This is an input where you have a participation of these stakeholders, cross-sectional and local communities, and the indigenous people said that this is something that has to be included on governance. On this recommendation on this relation of information, we see some changes, some aspect to be emphasized. We are not talking about just one plan for transition, but several plans for transition, which is my plan for transition in the case of water, deforestation, health of soils, and contamination, pollution. And the topic of the scenarios is going to be much more complex. Climate scenarios were better prepared, but here we have developed a guideline working with GPS and other organizations to advance in the topic of scenarios. But what is idea that the financial institution and each corporation will have a clear plan for transition regarding impact and dependency on nature. Now, regarding risk, we add impact, not only risk management system, but as well impact management system. And there is something very important for financial institutions, development financial institutions. The TNF framework helps us to tell the story of risk and opportunities. We take 5 negative promoters of change in nature that were developed by ICBES, and we expanded these for positive changes. And this means that in the pilot, Adonai is going to mention one, and Thomas as well another one. And he made a comment on this, the possibility to analyze risk management in the portfolio of investment and to tell the story in the portfolio of impact and how the financing institutions for development are advancing in their public mandate. For risk management, it's important to have this possibility to have tracking, the tracking of this project, not only to be acquainted with the project, but as well of the impact in the value chain. Most impacts on nature happen upstream or downstream, and sometimes we don't have time to consider this as a blind spot. Financial institutions should explain clearly this tracking record and along these aspects. Another final topic has to do with data.
That was also mentioned. There is a study, a Scopo study that we just launched. We had a data catalyst for nature and the need of having a public utility in nature data that will use the community-generated data, the data sets at global level, so the data will be more accessible and more solid when making decisions. Nature is talking now much more than 20 years ago, and the time has come to increase that level in the way of protecting life and the invitations of the banks, the public development banks and the development institutions will set the pace that will give an important signal and will produce the catalyzing environment, so the private equity may be also geared towards positive results with nature. Well, thank you very much, Felipe.
Español, vamos a...
Podemos hacerlo en inglés.
We can do it in English because in that sense, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development has been implementing a TNFD model. They have some lessons learned as well, so we would like to listen to that approach from the multilateral banks, how we work together with the national banks, local public banks. We have experiences working with private banks. What is the work being done by the European Bank? Thank you, Camilo. Thank you to the IDB for the invitation.
I'll summarize what we've done on the TNFD. How does it fit into the overall Paris alignment, climate risk, and green finance framework that we have for our investments? Bear in mind that we are a private sector focus and project finance focus development bank. So we work directly with private sector clients, not so much with national development banks or governments, right? And I would say I'd summarize my points into three areas. There's a need to integrate and streamline whatever, and this is a message we've sent to Felipe, we share with Felipe over and over. There is a need, thanks. There's a need to integrate and streamline the work we do on nature, because there's an overload of work on other themes already happening in the banks. We need to develop one single tool, that's the other, for nature and climate. And perhaps the WWF biodiversity risk filter could be one. That's the one we are exploring, but could be others. And there's a need to translate nature risks into financial risks, and coupling this nature risk assessment with the valuation of natural capital might be a route forward. That's what we've attempted, and so is S&P independently when we spoke to them a few months ago. So let me move on. We've launched a pilot, as Felipe said, within the overall commitment of the COP26 joint MDB statement on nature, people and planet, where as MDBs we committed to 5 different dimensions, to scale up nature in 5 different dimensions: leadership, update of our environmental social policies, scaling up financing, and we plan to, as EDRD, we plan to publicize a nature approach at the COP28 on how we plan to scale up nature finance. How to achieve synergies, and yesterday I spoke about the Blue Mediterranean Partnership as one synergy to actually scale up, support nature positive marine action. And then the last 2 dimensions is the evaluation of nature to guide decision making, and the better data and disclosure of nature. And it is within those 2 dimensions where the TNFD fits, right? But Felipe has mentioned, before I move into the pilot, Felipe has mentioned data, and that we see as a low-hanging fruit, inspired in the work that IFD is doing with its clients. IFD has started working with GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, to actually upload the data, ask their clients to upload the data, the baseline ecosystem data from their projects when that is gathered, when PR6 for us is triggered, to upload it in order to start replenishing a global database and use nature data as a global good. So use our projects to gather that data and track the evolution of nature data. We believe that's an excellent idea. So we're really grateful for you to share with us, and we plan to do this now in the update of our environmental social policy and the guidance note that guides the baseline assessment of our projects, right? And then now moving on to the TNFD. We prepared this pilot for the COP, ahead of the COP15 to present it, and we're grateful to be invited and present it there within the internal context of complexity. And again, streamlining is essential, because otherwise we will not be able to bring nature in the overall green finance assessments that are quite heavy already, right? In the pilot, we benefited from the work that we had done already for climate risks. I think we were the first NDB that issued a TCFD report in 2020 for 2019. And I think we've been the first NDB to launch this pilot. With this pilot, we leverage on TCFD and on the environmental social due diligence for impacts. So TCFD on dependencies and ESDD, environmental social due diligence on impacts. We looked into 200 direct projects and used Anchor and other tools to assess impacts and dependencies. We used, from the climate assessment that we already had, we used the location of projects and the sectors, because our already our TCFD framework is based on counterparty risk. It's purely financial risk we're looking into. So the project is important, but it's not as important as the counterparty, which is the counterparty is the ultimate risk we are assuming with our credit. That's important for dependencies, not for impacts. The impacts are reviewed on projects, but for dependencies, the counterparty is the overall dependency we focus on, right? What are the conclusions we extracted from the pilot? Well, that at least for the for the locate and evaluate phases of the LEAP framework, it was rather simple because we had the location, we had the sectors. It was relatively simple to flag risks. Then we also realized that many of the risks that were flagged had been already flagged for climate. So there is, we understood that of course climate is an accelerator of nature risks, especially when we are talking about projects that depend on water. But there is a conceptual need, and that's a point that I would make to Felipe. There's a need to unpick the causality, the transmission channels between nature and climate, right? Because when I speak to my risk management colleagues, they basically don't care too much when risks are flagged, either nature or climate. We need to know where they come from, where risks ultimately come from. Is it climate? Is it nature? And what's the interaction between both, right? But then there's also a need to properly assess the projects, because many of the projects we identified, actually we knew that nature was not at risk, especially when it related to water, right? And more importantly, and Felipe, you mentioned it, supply chain and value chain risks, upstream and downstream risks. I honestly don't know how we're going to tackle those, because it's very, very challenging. We've already seen that in our labor risks, in like known nature risks, but so this is not exclusive for nature, but it's extremely important for nature. Because as MDBs, we might be financing a production facility, but if that's sourcing palm oil, well, there's a clear risk. And if palm oil is a small component, well, there is a transmission channel to nature risk, right? So we need to understand what kind of tools we need to develop to properly, unfold those risks. And finally, as a corollary, we are developing this natural capital evaluation in order to take those nature risks and translate them into economic and financial risk, which is ultimately what matters for our risk departments, right? And the reason why TCFD was originally developed, right? So we've developed a tool at landscape level that actually is very complementary to the work that the World Bank has done on natural capital accounting at sovereign level. So basically, we try to provide the puzzles that will feed on the natural capital accounting. Again, we're project finance focused, so a bottom-up approach makes more sense for us, right? Right now, we're trying to integrate this NCV, this natural capital tool, into our Green Cities program to actually help decision makers in cities understand the value of nature. That was what we consider the low-hanging fruit for a relatively complex model. But that's the first step, right? And in summary, just to repeat my points, minimize process, develop a simple tool that covers climates and nature and helps understand what is the causality between both, the linkages between both, and translate nature risks into financial risk as well, which is what matters for investors, right? Not only matters that, but that's one of the key drivers for investors. That's all. Thank you, Camilo.
Thank you so much, Maunay. And we're almost done with the session, but you just mentioned this user-friendly approach and development of tools, and that's exactly what we have been working with Gemma and Kronos team, developing these toolkits that we are also launching to support national development banks and to support the region to start looking into this topic of nature-related risks. Gemma, if you wanna share a little bit of the work that we've been doing and what we're preparing.
Yep, sure. So as Camilla said, we've been working with IDB to develop a knowledge toolkit for NDBs. The aim is to arm NDBs with the knowledge and tools to take biodiversity risk and opportunities into account. And I was actually asked to cover a little bit more about the risks and opportunities first, just to frame the toolkit. So I'll just try and summarise this very shortly. As I mentioned earlier, biodiversity loss is recognised as a source of 3 types of financial risk. You've got physical, transition, systemic. And these can translate into things like credit, market, underwriting, operational, liquidity risks. And banks can be exposed to nature dependencies and impacts, but might not be aware of some of these biodiversity risks and opportunities that are generated from this, and then how they materialise financially. So, for example, things like physical risks, we see changes in the state of biodiversity that can impact the provision of ecosystem services on which those companies depend on. So for agriculture, there could be a decrease in pollination for growing crops. That means you get less yield and less productivity, and same for if you don't have enough fresh water for irrigation. That's just a simple example, but that would basically disrupt your production and cause supply chain disruption for the food sector. For transition risks, we're thinking around shifts towards, a biodiversity positive economy, such as changes in policy and regulation, market preferences, technological advances. So if we took the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, how can banks anticipate those changes to those policies and regulations in support of biodiversity? And then how will the business and activities in their portfolios actually prepare to respond to those, and what will that cost them to actually make those responses? So we wanted to create a practical tool and approach which would help banks anticipate and identify those risks and opportunities, and then to help prepare a strategy to manage those. So the toolkit presents a roadmap for NDBs to integrate biodiversity risks and opportunities, and then what we've done is just align the structure very closely with the TNFD. So there's no duplication. It's following a structure that's already there. So this is the only slide I've got. And I'm hoping that you're going to recognise some of those main elements, but the main difference here is just an additional element, which is more of an educational piece for those that are about to embark on assessing biodiversity risk and opportunity. So understanding the concepts and terminology which we presented earlier is really important. So biodiversity is different to climate change. It's a different language. It's not your usual financial terminology. So it's really important to understand what you're dealing with and how it's relevant to your portfolio. Governance, we'd expect governance for all ESG issues, and it doesn't necessarily have to come next in this steps or sequence. It might be that you want to do the assessment first to help getting that board level buy-in and executive level to buy-in, and before you make any changes to governance infrastructure. Strategy, so to develop a biodiversity strategy, you need to assess and prioritise impacts and dependencies and risk and opportunities. And in this section, the toolkit basically uses the TNFD LEAP approach. So that's the locate, evaluate, assess, prepare, to help with that assessment and screening. And this starts looking at what data banks actually need to collect and use. And we've got a little bit of a screening tool which we'll be piloting with some banks to test that out. Risk management, this is about translating the biodiversity strategy into action. So different levers that banks can actually pull are identified here to implement that strategy. And then metrics and targets, so setting measurable and robust targets and the metrics used to measure progress against them. This is still an emerging area. So what we've done is actually just collated existing resources and some of the different indicators that are out there for this. So the knowledge toolkit is still in draft and it is in development. So this is maybe not be the final piece, but it just gives you a little bit of a very high level taster of what's in there. As part of this development for the toolkit, we conducted a mapping of different tools and models to analyse biodiversity related financial risks, and that will be incorporated into the toolkit. I think one main message here is that there are some basic first steps that can be taken to do this assessment, and there are lots of existing resources that are out there to help do that, and that toolkit collates all of these to help banks with starting those first steps. And as I mentioned, we'll also be piloting the toolkit with 2 banks in the Latin American region, and obviously in collaboration with IDB, and we'll plan to incorporate those learnings into the toolkit as well, so you've got that practical perspective too. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Gemma.
And this is very important because within the goals of the Montreal Agreement, besides the commitment of preserving 30% of oceans by 2030, we have to mobilize $200 billion per year. And this is what we're talking about the possibility of helping the development banks in the countries so as to generate reports and to develop and to implement the tools from the IDB. In the IDB, we are also implementing these models within our portfolio analysis, the dependence of nature and ecosystems, and the risk as well. And we can build the strategy. We have 5 minutes left. I do not know if you want to ask questions or shall we, I mean, if the attendees have a question, could you help us with the microphone, please? We will listen to these 3 questions and then we can answer. Good morning. My name is Veronica Ostifa. I come from Catamarca, Argentina. I'm sharing the observatories with Chile and Bolivia. This is the area that is more affected by lithium extraction. These 3 days we were listening a lot, talking about development, energy transition, sustainability, but the ones that are enduring processes that will take 30 years extraction process. So it is necessary to talk about these during these days. In principle, because it's not a transition, we're talking about the energy replacement. We're not talking about consumption reduction, as it will be possible to move on without decreasing. A transition that is replacement and that will support the standard of living of a global north, by those against those that are in the south. In Catamarca, Argentina, they have dried completely 11 kilometers of a river, a damage that has not been solved and that has not been repaired. In biodiversity, salares are ecosystems that are quite fragile and for retaining the carbon that we need for climate crisis. So it's a contradiction to believe that the transition is going to be done with lithium. So specifically, the banks, specifically IFC, granted more than $200 million to Sal de Vida project, and Lead Invest is giving $50 million more. These projects that are 9 in the same salar without any assessment, environmental impact assessment. What we're asking ourselves is, what are we doing? What development are we thinking about when we have, for example, environmental disaster experiences? And from the communities, it's impossible to maintain a system that has failed already. Provinces with more of 47% poverty, it's with the decrease. This is something that has not been mentioned, and it's impossible to maintain this standard of living, and it's with nature, not against nature. Thank you. We can listen to the second question. You're right. That's why we're including nature risk in climate risk. That is precisely the urgency of acting on the dependency on ecosystem and impact. This is the reason for this panel. Thank you for your intervention.
Technical question to the banks that are now considering climate risk and maybe one day biodiversity risk in their due diligence. I'm very happy that you are considering it, and I learned that that you look at the amount of risk. At the end of the day, the question is, do you consider that risk also in the pricing and in the, let's say, when you put equity aside for the risk that you have in your balance sheet? Have you gone so far that climate risk and biodiversity risk is being part of your pricing? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Teresa Mazo from Colombia. I am representing the Agriculture and Mining Association, and we are concerned by the problem that we have because of mining and the damage to the territory and water sources. I am go back to my region very happy after listening to the proposal that they have here, with the hope that we can really have actions concrete, because we are asking, we have SOS here for the protection of hydric sources, because the banking community and the states are working together, and that deserves to create a permanent discussion table to take care of this issue. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for these questions. And to quickly respond, Teresa and Veronica's intervention, I think there is something that I forgot to, something that is fundamental for the transparency level we are looking for with TNF, and that is the importance of location. Organizations must have a transparent analysis and to communicate in the business model on what are the sites with high biodiversity that have the biomass that is being lost, where they do interact with that, and to be transparent with respect to how they are having the ecosystemic services that were mentioned by Gema before. So it's one of the basic proposals of TNFD to have the interface with this location to see what is the involvement with the territory stakeholders and the ecosystemic flows that have accumulative impacts, and that is going to be complex to define that, but many colleagues mentioned that the other leap will be the collective leaps, a analysis of the action, but it's a fundamental aspect. We cannot have more indicators about what the company is doing, but indicators of what is happening at the territory level. Is there any additional comment?
The first one, I wouldn't give the impression that we are not currently taking environmental risk into account when we commit additional funds. We actually do. What I'm talking about is whether at portfolio level in our risk policy or financial policy, we're going to price those risks when we typically make a loan to a particular country because it has a significant risk. So we are beginning typically to discuss climate risk, to integrate climate risk at the level of an economy in our rating of a particular economy. And this has an impact a little, not necessarily on the pricing of our sovereign loans, because we do that at AFD for the on the account of the government, but the sovereign rating has an impact on our lending to private actors. So in a word, we are taking climate topics into account in our pricing and in our risk assessment policy. So not only to grant, when we make new loans, commit new loans, but also on the pricing. Maybe one quick answer on standard and living and sobriety and consumption. I think it's an important topic. Which has political implication. I don't think, but it's just a personal opinion, there would be a general majority, let's say in France or in even more so in developing countries, to reduce standard living overall. However, that does not mean that we cannot reduce consumption, let's say, of energy. In France, last winter, we reduced by 10% consumption of electricity and natural gas because of the level of prices, because of the risk of cuttings, and with actually very few consequences on the standard of living, because people probably save money on natural gas and electricity, and maybe consume other types of services, with of course a much lesser impact on climate. So what I would imagine is rather sobriety on the types of consumption that generate negative impacts for climate or for biodiversity, which does not necessarily mean that there won't be any movements towards other things that also generate positive impact for your standard of living. Health will be more expensive tomorrow, for example, so you can imagine people are going to consume more health, but probably with little impact on the environment. Similarly, you could say that education and culture, there are other sectors where you can increase your consumption or your use of services with a smaller impact of the environment. So I would imagine rather transfers of what we actually want in life rather than just a general and homogeneous drop.
Gracias, Camilo.
Thank you, Camilo. Of course, I do share the concern of these people that were asking us, and I would like to underscore the role of public policies. Felipe, TNFD and TSFD and other initiatives. These are initiatives of the private sector. And I believe that they will be much more effective if we had in our countries a legal framework, not only the law, but a rule of law that will take into consideration nature. And it is important for us to demand not only to the companies, to the financial sector, but in public policies aspects. If you look at what had happened in some countries, like in mine, with respect to the decrease of the capacity to have environmental policies, it's something really alarming. So we're going to do our best from the private sector and the academia to move forward with these measures, but we should not forget that at the end, the framework will come from public policies. And if we do not have the framework, it will be much more difficult for the private initiatives to move to change the situation that we want to change. Thank you very much. So that's it. And before COP15, we saw a campaign, Make It Obligatory, where a important group of companies and financial institutions were requesting the global leaders to make it mandatory, the reports. And I think that in that sense, we have, as citizens, as stakeholders, we need to insist on the urgency of transformation, because it's a great opportunity of transforming and solving these climate crisis and financial crisis. The time is over. Thank you very much for those that attended. It was impossible to get to a detailed level, to the level that we wanted in the conversations. I invite you to get in contact with each one of the panel members if you want any additional information. Thank you for being here. So let's congratulate Camilo. It's his birthday today.
The night's still young and I'm taking my chances. So I call on my friends and I tell them to make it. I follow my heart, don't ask for questions. Don't have much time, so I hope you're with it. I won't let the sun go down on me. I won't let the sun go.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday happy birthday, happy birthday.